It is important to discuss about education, science, and policy within the framework of the EU, but also in combination with the global affairs taking shape around us. Today, I have the distinct pleasure to have with us Professor Manuel Muñiz, who's director of the IIE University and also the dean of the School of Politics, Economics, and Global Affairs. My name is Dr. Marios Eftimiopoulos. I'm the founder of Strategy International, and this is Prime Analysis. Professor Muñiz, dear Manuel, thank you very much for coming into another web series of Strategy International's Prime Analysis.
Thank you, Maris. I'm delighted to be here and very much looking forward to the exchange.
It's been an honor to discuss with you on a variety of things, which I think I'm going to try to pick on your mind for a few things that I know that you're going to feel very comfortable with, especially in international affairs. But part of our, if you want, web series is to actually start with the personality that we're discussing with. So I know that you have done a lot of things through your life, from academia to politics, back to academia. But I want to start with Manuel, the young person starting in Spain, deciding he wants to go in political science and so on. Tell us a few things about yourself.
So I was born in Spain, in a small town in the north of Spain called León, but I grew up mostly in Madrid. And I first studied law and finance, and I started working as a lawyer. And for a number of years, that's what I did. I started working on international legal issues. So I started traveling quite a bit to the eastern part of Europe. So I went a lot to Poland, to Hungary, to Romania, to Bulgaria. And some of these places, particularly Bulgaria and Romania, I was there before EU accession. So it was right at the time when they were entering the EU. And I saw this incredible process of transformation that the EU brought with it, because my generation in Spain did not live that. When I was young, Spain was already a full member of the EU. So that was more my parents' generation that had seen the shift, sort of the convergence with the EU of the countries on the border of the Union, what accession does to them. But I saw it so I was fortunate because I could see it in these places, how they adapted all of their legal architecture. So I would leave, come back, and they would have changed their civil code, their penal code, their commercial code. It's amazing, how their societies were changing, the economies were changing. And I realized that was something that went beyond the law. I mean, there were other forces, sociological, economic, political forces that were driving these countries to do these extraordinary things. So I decided to go back to university. So I went back to academia, and I did my master's in public administration. I must have been 20 odd years old at the time. I did this at the Kennedy School at Harvard. So I went to the US, and I did that for a couple of years. And that was it for me, because I was hooked on the power of political science to explain the world, to explain human dynamics. And once you're bitten by that bug, it's very hard to go back to slightly narrower kinds of work, and I still love law, and I think it's very important to understand the world. It's a net of legal relations, but there are major forces behind it that shape how the law looks and how it functions, and those are political and economic and sociological, anthropological to some extent. But I mean, the political is maybe the last of its manifestations. So I decided that I would stay in academia. I did my doctorate, and that was it. So that my career really shifted. So that was a big moment for me intellectually and professionally in my mid-20s or so.
But I understand you also decided to go into politics. And I think this is the next step from academia into practice, into policy and decision making. Tell us a few things about this.
Yeah. So it's interesting because when I got to the US and I started doing this policy program, I discovered a profile, a type of person that I hadn't seen when I was in Spain. And there were these academics that had a foot in academia, and that was for most of them their main affiliation. They were either professors, very senior administrators, or professors of practice. And most of them had some engagement with the world outside. They were on boards, they had served governments, they worked for multilaterals, they were public intellectuals. And this was rare in Spain at the time. It still is, actually. I mean, there's not that sort of engagement and meshing of academia with the world of practice. But that's what I wanted to do. I thought that life was fascinating, very non-hierarchical. You were very free to do all of these things. So I went to the UK. I did a doctorate. So I did a doctorate in international relations in the UK. And in fact, I went back after that to the US to work. I came back to Spain after that. And after being in Spain for a number of years, by then I was 30, 35, 36, I got offered to join the Spanish government as Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I said yes, because I had been building my career with this sense of public service and with this sense of mixing theory and practice, which I think is a real there's real wisdom. Not that I have it, but other folks definitely have it through this path. But there's real wisdom in having an academic mindset, knowing the theory of things, knowing literature, the literature of a field, but then having direct experience of the management of things. And for me, that was, of course, joining the government and doing what I could at the time. And I did that for 2 years, and then I came back to academia, and I'm now back in university. But I'm a firm believer, and for folks listening to this, if there's any young people listening to this that are thinking about this, I'm a firm believer in this path where you mix these two worlds.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
yeah, that's what I did, and that's that and a deep sense of public service and trying to do my best for my country that had given me so much and still does. I mean, I'm a very fortunate person. Were the reasons that led me to join the government. Yeah.
Needless to say, I've been noticing your career and your path for many years now, and we had the pleasure to meet and actually do this interview, for which I thank you very much. But you mentioned at some point policy and academia, and I know you're the director of IE University in Madrid. You're also the dean of the School of International Affairs. I want you to tell us a few things about the university itself, because I think that the way that you envision things and that you talk is exactly the envisionment of the IE, the way that I interpret as a colleague, if you want, as a fellow scientist, at least from the way that it's protected and the way of the faculty and the multinationality faculty and the environment that you're working with.
Yeah. So, IE University is based in Madrid and in Segovia in Spain, and we just turned 50. So this is the 50th anniversary of the institution, which is not a lot, for academic institutions, but for over 35 years of those 50, IE was a business school. So it was born as a business school, and it only became a fully fledged university 15, 16 years ago. So the business school DNA is still very much in the institution, and there's a lot of healthy things about a business DNA. Very entrepreneurial, very dynamic, very applied, very, very much in contact with the real world. And my own experience and the experience in government really sort of brought home for me the value of that. When I was in government, by the way, I mean, one of the things you learn is the complexity of large organizations and
Yes,
of large processes. You learn humility because when you're exclusively an academic, you can
of
afford
course,
the luxury of just sort of
of course,
recommending
of
things.
course.
But we have too many gurus on the sidelines of things. We need folks, to get dirty and see how complex these things are in practice, no? And so you become more humble. So I think, at least on a personal level, I really discovered, or reaffirmed the value of practice. And I had this long tradition as a business school of valuing this. So the way the institution is now built, it has a number of core values, but I would say one of the key features is the intersection, the interweaving sort of the real world and the world of learning. And
Mhm.
this is something we work at very hard so that the experience of our students is as close as it can be to the world of practice and to addressing real world issues. And you do that through the type of teaching, the content. You do that through the experience within the program, so the internships, the capstones, which are these final
Absolutely,
thesis,
absolutely.
final masters or final bachelors, mini consultancies that the students do. We were just speaking before you started rolling for the podcast of the intensity of visits. So we're constantly we bring the world here into the
Hmm.
classroom, and
Hmm.
we try to bring the classroom into the world. So they go out, our students go out, they do immersion weeks, they participate in major conferences around the world. And this idea, of bringing these two things together is, I think, fundamental to what university in the 21st century should look like.
Indeed, indeed.
Much less detached, protected, or walled off from the real world than in the past. There is a reason for this, by the way, and that is that in the past, a lot of universities were in the business of protecting information and then almost transferring information to the next generation. So they were in the business of information arbitrage. But with the digital revolution and now with the AI and generative AI revolutions, I can tell you the value of
Yeah.
moving information from one place to another is much diminished. It's much more about how you manage that information, how you deal with real world issues in a creative and effective way. So again, this enmeshing of these worlds responds or is an answer to a much broader trend of what universities are to a large extent about.
Very good. You mentioned a lot of things, especially about the in-class and out-of-class experiences that a student should get, and we also mentioned policy elements. So let's start, if you want, to do a bit of analysis with regard to the current, or if you want, pending issues that are happening. I would like to start with the European Union. The European Union
Mm-hmm.
being, we have elections upcoming in the June 2024. We have a lot of things which are very open. Have a war in Russia and Ukraine. You have a nearby war in the Middle East. I would like to concentrate a bit on Europe, and then we will go separately on these areas of conflict. But the European Union, you mentioned it from the beginning. You envisioned a European Union that is changing. It is still changing. But there is a lot
Mm-hmm.
of criticism with regards to how effective the European Union can actually be. We're both what I call European babies. And we are European babies because we grew with the ethics and the morals of Europe. That Europe can be better, can be stronger. And I think there is a strategic path where we need to decide whether Europe will go global or not. Because if Europe goes global, then we have to upgrade a lot of things with regard to our institutions, decision making processes, support, engagement into a variety of things. What's your intake with regard to the future of the European Union, considering also that we're coming at another crossroad with the elections in June 24?
Well, I'll tell you right off the bat what my hope is because I'm a very strong Europeanist. I think this is a project of peace and it's a project of prosperity. And for those of us that travel a lot
Hmm.
for job and move around the world and try to understand the dynamics that shape global politics, so I go to Asia a lot and I go to India, to China as much as I can, to the US still. Uh, I still go quite a bit. You know, I mean, no single European country is of any relevant scale on its own to shape almost any dynamic globally, any diplomatic, economic, security dynamic that matters to our citizens is something that any
Correct.
single European state can shape on its own. So, you know, I mean, this is, do we want to have a footprint? Do we want to have a say on global issues and to be able to project values that are very important for us, like the role of women in society, like the protection of minorities, like the importance of certain rights and freedoms that we cherish very deeply? Do we want these things to be enshrined and protected globally? Then, to be
Hmm.
quite frank, as a Spaniard and as a European, I do not see a different answer to saying we need to do this together within the framework of the EU. And although we look quite different to each other within the EU at points, and it's a very diverse continent with many
Yes.
languages, cultures, traditions, actually, when you zoom out and you look at the world, we're in fact not that different. And in fact, if you speak to people in India or China or Japan, in fact, they look at us and they think that we're actually quite similar, and we are, in our worldview. So that's there from the beginning. Now, on the future of Europe, I think a lot will depend on our ability to address the underlying drivers of political polarization in Europe and of the drivers of the rise of um, anti-European nationalist leadership in Europe. So this is my biggest concern. It's the
Yes.
internal threat to the European project that some of these political forces that are rising, of course, in Poland, in Italy, in Germany, in France, I mean, almost all over the place, including in Spain as well. Although it's very hard to be anti-European in Spain politically because the popular support for anti-European positions is very low. But if these forces continue to rise, and they continue to enter governments nationally, and they continue to enter the institutions in Brussels, the parliament, but also the council and many, many other institutions in Brussels that are populated by the outcomes of the elections nationally, what takes place at the national level. It's going to be very hard for the project to continue or deepen in any meaningful way. So the question is, how do we address the rise of polarized politics and of national populism in European countries? And that's a huge question. My answer is through equity and social justice, because I've been looking at this for quite some time, and I find that the economics of our countries are quite out of whack. And I think they're the fundamental driver. There are other drivers, but I think the economics are a fundamental driver of the rise of polarization in Europe. So I would really focus on the domestic dynamics within European countries if we want to then be able to address any of the European level issues.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, because we also see this part of in this part of the world in Cyprus. We also see that polarization becoming a reality, and I think we should avoid that, because it seems that we have not learned from our lessons of the 20th century yet. And I still believe that we have a lot of options, but being a person myself, also as you said, traveling, have been lived in 9 countries in my life, different civilization, different cultures, and also outside the EU. I see as a very important key aspect that the Europeans, which the Europeans probably don't see because it's an everyday life policy with Europe. Outside of Europe, you see the power of the European Union. And outside Europe, you see other civilizations trying to inherit the standards of the EU, whether this is an individual state within the EU or the collective states of the EU. And I would also agree that alliances actually make things happen and make things, the right way. And we cannot do it without the European Union. And you're absolutely right on this. But the European Union, and I'm now leading, if you want, into the second subject, is now being threatened by volatility and regional instability in its eastern, northern corridors, in its southern corridors. The war in Ukraine and Russia is not finishing. I know that we will eventually connect all these dots together, but the European Union has recently agreed for another bailout help in Ukraine with 50 billion euros, which I think they should do. They should do, because Ukraine, especially from the moment that Ukraine inspires itself to become a member of the EU, then we should help them becoming a member of the EU. But nevertheless, the war in Russia is still raging, and I don't foresee an end of conflict before 2027. What is your intake on how does Spain see it from your experience as a former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs? If you were at this point now and you had to negotiate this really important case that can really damage, if you want, the European structure itself as well, how would you, what are the things that you would do, or how can we propose an end to the conflict? Because I also believe that the United Nations role, which is very important also, they don't seem to have a solution to the pending, to the current issue, to the current war.
So there's no doubt in my mind at all, that we have to support Ukraine in every way possible, that the war that is being waged on Ukraine on the part of Russia is indefensible from almost any point of view, but the most significant of them is that it is indefensible from an international law point of view. Mm-hmm. It breaches in a very obvious way the Charter of the United Nations. It is a breach of the right to sovereignty of states, of the right to territorial integrity of states, and it constitutes the clearest breach in Europe of those principles and norms since the end of the Second World War. We had not seen since the end of the Second World War a country launch a major invasion of a neighbor, of a democratic country. The size, it's larger than Germany. So Ukraine is larger than Germany in size. I mean, this is a major military operation initiated unilaterally with no justification under international law. So I think, by the way, Europeans and Americans, I'm not sure we've done a terribly good job at explaining this properly in the global South and in countries that are that are looking at this and still confused as to why they should commit to this. in any major way. Thankfully, there have been votes in the General Assembly of the UN that have overwhelmingly condemned the operation and the invasion on the part of Russia. We haven't been successful at bringing too many countries into the sanctions scheme that has been deployed against Russia. So first of all, I think we cannot let this stand, and we should do everything in our power to prevent this action from having any positive consequence for Russia. And this includes, of course, the acquisition of territory through the use of force that is sometimes discussed as a possibility in a peace negotiation. I'm also worried not just on the principle, but on the practicality of Russia doing well out of this and what that would mean for the security of other neighboring countries, particularly the Baltics, Moldova, and countries
Also,
in the
Caucasus,
region.
like Georgia as well,
Sorry?
like Georgia, who's inspiring
Georgia.
to
I mean,
join the EU.
immediately, I was not too long ago in Estonia. The Russians have been conducting for many years a military exercise during the summer in that part of the country. It's called the Zapad exercise. I mean, it involves tens of thousands of troops. Can you imagine the nature of that exercise as seen from Latvia, from Lithuania, from Estonia, if the Russians had managed to consolidate territorial gains in Ukraine through an outright invasion like the one that we're seeing? I mean, just imagine the perception, what this now means for all of the neighbors in the region. So this simply cannot stand. And I think Europeans and Americans should continue to support the Ukrainians as much as possible. Now, this still leaves us with a deep problem, which is we have a conflict that is raging, very conventional in many ways. I mean, with huge casualties on both sides, loss of equipment. I mean, very conventional type of warfare. Also quite sophisticated in other fronts, the use of drones, the use of cyber, quite extensive attacks on connectivity infrastructure and things of the like, without an end in sight. I mean, for the moment, quite with a stalemate on the ground.
Yes.
We're left with what seem to be very clear violations of human rights and of the commission of war crimes on the ground on the part of the Russians that are going to be prosecuted all over the world and in every institution that allows for the prosecution of this. So a very deep diplomatic fracture with Russia that will be very hard to heal. And we're also left with a package of sanctions and set of measures that basically produces the undoing of 30, 40 years of economic interdependence built with Russia since the end of the Cold War. So this is a big divorce. It's structural, and it's going to commit a generation on both sides. I do not see a normalization of relations with Russia anywhere on the horizon for us, and this is tragic, but it's what we are faced with, and it was thrown at us because of the actions of the Russian government. So there's nothing, and people say, but what's the solution? What's the end game? Well, some problems do not have a solution in sight, but you have a management problem, and we have a tactical. We need to manage the current state of affairs, and the way you do that is through the supply of finances and of weapons to the Ukrainians, and that's it. Mm-hmm. That is enough. It's hard enough, and it's good enough given the circumstances that we have.
And it seems. From my point of view, from my experience, one of the things that I foresee is that the Russians want to have this gray zone, like a frozen conflict status quo, the same one that exists in Cyprus at this point, which is a solution to the no solution to the future to come, and it seems that the Russians are willing to do that because eventually. Putin says all the time, I don't want to border a NATO country or a potential NATO country for that matter. But I think this is also to the decision makers to take a decision to this. But in the south, in the straight south, because if you see it southern, you go to the Balkans, you go to the Cyprus issue, and then you go to the Middle East. We do consider from this side of the earth that all things are interconnected with each other. And I think the Russians have taken from the case of the Cypress Division, the unlawful division that is happening from the 1974 invasion of Turkey into Cyprus. They have taken this case and probably applied it into Ukraine, which is very interesting to see the comparative approaches or the legal differences from the beginning to the end, and so on and so forth.
There is a broader question here, Marius, which I think is interesting, which is, are these events part of a broader trend of the sort of the end of the unipolar moment, where
Yes.
the United States had a huge proportion of the global economy, an immense proportion of the global spending on security and defense, a huge diplomatic weight around the world. And as that world comes to an end because of relative shifts in power globally, you begin to have a challenge to the provision of global public goods, including global security, deterrence of the use of force, and many others. So it's this weakened state of the US globally and of its allies that leads to sort of noise in the periphery of the order, you know? And things that in the past would have been unthinkable because they would have actually sparked retaliation or huge cost on other fronts with the US and allies now seem affordable. So, and I actually buy that I actually think that we are witnessing some of this noise emerging from a world that is now more multipolar, and where there should be different providers of some of these goods, but they're not stepping up, or it's taking them time to ramp up their capacity to provide them. So the safety of sea lanes, international peacekeeping, multilateral institutions and their ability to be effective. Many of these things were in fact predicated on having a major actor like the US taking care of all of them. No? So I think that there is some noise to the multipolarity that we're entering. Yeah.
Very good. Keeping in mind that I know that you have a busy schedule, I would like to concentrate on three last things, and I will start with your immediate region in Spain, Morocco and the Maghreb countries, the collaboration. You're the first entrance point to the EU from the northern part, from Morocco to those areas in Europe. I know that recently there have been a lot of developments with regards to the bilateral relations and also the Western, if you want, Africa region. How does Spain, having the biggest stake element along with also Portugal, I presume, with regards to these part of the world, how do you foresee the development of relations? I've seen some development in energy, in technology, in education. So how do you see these things developing?
Well, so I'm on Morocco, some of the countries in the region. I'm actually quite optimistic. I think there is space for this part of the world to do extremely well if the institutions do well and the governance works well. So this immense process of nearshoring, reshoring, de-risking, however you want to call it, of supply chains and production, which I think is ongoing. And if you look at the trade figures, global trade figures, it looks as if trade at the aggregate level is still growing. But actually, if you look at the breakdown, what you'll see is that what we began is a process of regionalization of trade dynamics very, very markedly. And this is a consequence of the rising global risks and the sense of exposure of states and the sense of exposure of corporations to various kinds of risks in far-flung and far-away geographies. To some extent, by the way, as a consequence of what happened in Ukraine and Russia, where I think it's something like 3,000, 4,000 European companies had to leave Russia in the space of weeks after the invasion because of the effects of sanctions, or just the secondary effects of reputation and others in just continuing engagement in Russia. So they had to leave. So many of them are recalibrating from where they operate, where they have suppliers. And I think one of the biggest winners of this could be Morocco to a large extent. I think the Turks also are very well placed for this. So they could become sort of the Mexico of the single market. They could become the big producers where a lot of the textiles are produced. The auto industry could be very key, some of the tech sectors as well. So, if they play their hand right, I think this is a unique opportunity for them economically. No, probably the biggest opportunity they've had.
So
for 100 years.
This is neighborhood policy EU 101, with the exception that it was pushed because of a war. Because you mentioned Turkey, not a EU member, Morocco, not an EU member, but then bordering EU. So it seems that there is, if you want, some sort of indirect push to good neighborly relations. And let me go now to something that presumably you like. I know you've invited a lot of leaders from these parts of the world to join your university recently as well. Latin America. Latin America plays a pivotal role, not only because of the language and the former Spanish Empire in Latin America and the civilization that it left, also, but also the good trade relations. How does Spain see Latin America, considering all these challenges from climate elements to massive illegal migration from Mexico, for example, to the United States, but at the same time, the threat with each other, with some countries trying to invade each other for natural resources. How do you see this element? Like how do you see? I
So,
mean, you probably examine it, you've seen it, you've traveled to it.
well, yes, and one of our big literary figures said that you cannot really be Spanish if you do not know Latin America, no, or you don't know. So that there's a large part of our history there, a large part of our future. To a large extent, Latin America is Spanish. To a large extent, Spain is Latin American. I mean, it's I mean, the connection of these two parts of the world is just immense, no? If ethnically, family-wise, culturally, business-wise. I would say probably sort of the 30,000 feet reflection is that for Spain, Latin America is part of the West. It's part of the West culturally, institutionally, politically. And this has been our view for a very long time. And we need to engage as equals with Latin American countries and bring them in through trade, through diplomatic engagement, through security engagement into what we would call the Western world and the Western family of nations. Now, the Latin Americans themselves, at some instances, I think, have seemed unsure that this was what they were or where they fit in the world. So, this is not a non-controversial debate in Latin America itself. But for the most part, I would say that they have felt particularly connected to this. They're clearly not Easterners. They're barely Southerners, as we understand them. So, I mean, there is this element of connection. Now, the region enters a pivotal decade, a very pivotal decade. China has come into the region economically in a way that is unprecedented. It's now the major trading partner for a majority of countries in the region by a long way. It's the biggest lender for some of the countries in the region, again, by a long way to some of the governments in the region through its development banks and others. In fact, it holds the largest stock of debt in the region than any other actor, be it the Inter-American Development Bank or the IMF or the World Bank or the Latin American Development Bank, CAF. So yeah, I mean and it's also now a holder of big stocks of investment as well that are growing. So almost on all of these levels of economic importance, China has risen immensely, and this will have a reflection in the diplomacy of the region. And depending on how China-US, China-Europe relations evolve, we will see a Latin America that behaves in one way or another, but many countries will be heavily, heavily conditioned by that relationship. So I see this for the first time since the peak of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was relevant for some countries in the
Yeah,
region,
they come
the
back.
Cubans and a few others. But I see this as unique and as unprecedented in the last 30 years and much more generalized and pervasive
Indeed.
than Soviet presence ever was. The Russians are also there through trade and a couple of other things, but not as significant, particularly in the primary sector, but not as significantly as the Chinese. So I think for us, they're part of the West. We're not doing enough to bring them in and to partner with them. And they're going to have to make up their mind in the next decade in complicated ways.
One of the interesting things with Latin America, if you want South America, was the agreement between the European Union and the Mercosur, which took 19 years for a decision for trade of goods, and that says, for me, that says a lot. Because if you want to
But,
trade, if you want to help, if you want to invest, you just do it. You don't need 19 years to do that. Just imagine the
but
administrations that changed.
yeah, but it hasn't been finalized. I mean, the Mercosur EU deal has not yet been finalized. It needs to be finalized and ratified.
Mm.
It was the hope of the Spanish EU presidency to get it done during our presidency. We couldn't do it. So it's off to the next presidency. Let's see if the Belgians can do it.
Yeah, for application.
We have been pushing from Spain consistently, saying that this goes beyond trade. This is
Agreed.
about
Agreed.
geopolitics. It's about
I
engaging
agree.
with the region in a structured way. And it hasn't we haven't been successful within the EU and in other places for this to be fully understood. This is more than trade. So that's one of the litmus tests of our true commitment to the engagement with Latin America, is that treaty, for example, that can give you a very clear signal of how seriously we're taking this.
Last question, and important, the one that you mentioned multiple times, a country that you mentioned it, but I'm going to the eastern part of the world. I'm going to China. Now,
Yeah.
is China, or can China be, or continue to be, a good partner to the European Union? Can it be a trusted partner to the European Union without damaging the relations with the United States, considering the competition between these big superpowers such as the United States and China? Or can the EU bring a balance between those two? Maybe, maybe not.
It will become ever harder, because I think the relationship between the two, China and the US, will worsen. I mean, I see very few drivers of true improvement in the relationship. The economic competition is getting tougher, particularly at the frontier of the economy. The political system competition is there. I mean, two very different political models. The regional dynamics are not very promising. So the allies of the US in the region are very worried about the rise of China and its behavior in the region, and are bound to bring the US in, rather than sort of, keep the US calm and not engage. Rather, they're probably triggers for US engagement in the region, if anything. So the relationship will get worse, I think, and more tense. And it will be a success if it's managed properly and kept, away from conflict. Now, that does not mean that it will not have spillover effects all over the world, and it'll be very tough to maintain these gray areas between the two countries. So the two will put great pressure on their allies to take sides and to align. And I think the Europeans will be in the middle of this tug of war. Europe is big enough in terms of population, of economy, to have its own foreign policy. So, it will have its own foreign policy towards China. But I don't think it's going to be fully detached from that of the US. I think the cost of that would be immense. And I think it runs contrary to European interests. But we'll probably engage with China more than the US. But definitely not as if, everything was absolutely perfect, because that's not going to be the case, no? So, but this is not just a problem for the Europeans. It's going to be a problem for lots of countries. I was just in Singapore, and the Singaporeans are very worried, because this is a country that has made a living out of, doing an arbitrage between the relationship, that it has with these two countries. So now it finds itself in a space where, these gray areas are running, they're becoming very thin. So, this will happen to other countries around the world. It will happen to multilateral institutions that will be caught in the crossfire. So it's a world that looks much more like the one before 1990 than the one after 1990. So a world of blocks, complexity of engagement across these blocks. There'll be a large part of the world, particularly the global south, that will seek to avoid alignment, but there'll be costs as well to non-alignment. So this is much more similar to the 20th century than to the 21st.
I know that we could speak for hours and hours and topics after topics, but I also know how engaged you are, Professor Muñiz, dear Manuel. I would like to thank you on behalf of Strategy International and myself as well, of our team, for being here at our Prime Analysis. And I do hope that we can blossom, if you want, our collaboration, both in person but also institutionally in the near future to come. But I really have to thank you for this, because it was a very, very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Matt. It's a real pleasure, and I hope folks enjoy it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all for watching another web series of Strategy International. Please like, share, subscribe, and follow into our social media. My name is Dr. Marios Eftimiopoulos, and I'm the founder of Strategy International. This was Prime Analysis. And remember, impact makes a difference.